In December 1944, the Ardennes forest became a frozen graveyard, where the survival of the Allied cause rested on a single, impossible promise made by General George Patton. With 10,000 paratroopers of the 101st Airborne surrounded at Bastogne, Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower faced total collapse until Patton vowed to move 3 entire divisions through a blinding blizzard in just 72 hours. This is the story of Operation Greif, the deadly German spy panic, and the relentless march of old blood and guts to defy the impossible. The crisis erupted on the 16th of December, 1944, when Adolf Hitler launched his final desperate gamble in the West, known as Operation Watch on the Rhine, which history would forever remember as the Battle of the Bulge. 3 German armies, comprising 30 divisions and over 400,000 men, smashed into the weakest point of the Allied line in the dense, snow-choked Ardennes forest of Belgium, creating a devastation so swift that within 48 hours, German panzer divisions had torn a bulge 50 miles deep into the American positions. Communication and networks collapsed instantly as entire regiments found themselves cut off in the chaotic, freezing woods. And at the heart of this unfolding catastrophe lay the critical crossroads town of Bastogne, where 7 major roads converged, making it the strategic prize that could allow the Germans to split the Allied armies and reach the coast. To prevent this total unraveling of the European invasion, the United States Army rushed the 101st Airborne Division to hold the town at all costs, despite these paratroopers being lightly armed infantry, never intended for sustained tank battles against heavy German armor. By the 21st of December, the German noose had closed completely around the town, trapping 18,000 soldiers under the command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, who were now outnumbered 4-1 and shivering in foxholes as temperatures plunged below zero. Medical supplies vanished and ammunition ran critically low, while men were dying from treatable wounds or freezing to death in their holes as German artillery pounded the town relentlessly, circling like wolves around wounded prey. On December 22nd, German commanders sent a formal demand for surrender, leading to McAuliffe's legendary one-word response of nuts, a rallying cry that entered history but did little to stop the shells or the biting cold, as the soldiers inside the perimeter stared at a gray, oppressive sky, praying for air support that could not fly in the blinding blizzard. They were alone in facing annihilation unless a miracle arrived from the south, but the miracle was being threatened by a danger they could not see, a shadow lurking within their own ranks that would soon turn the Ardennes into a landscape of pure paranoia. While the paratroopers held the line, a different kind of war was being waged behind the scenes as Adolf Hitler had unleashed his most unconventional weapon, SS-Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, the man known as the most dangerous in Europe, who was tasked with Operation Greif. Skorzeny formed the 150th Panzer Brigade, a secret unit of German soldiers who spoke fluent English and were dressed in captured American uniforms, driving American jeeps, and even using modified German tanks disguised to look like United States M10 tank destroyers. Their mission was to infiltrate Allied lines, sabotage communications, and spread lethal confusion. But their greatest success was the psychological terror they instilled by spreading rumors of a decapitation strike aimed at the Allied high command. The spy panic gripped the Allied rear as rumors swirled that Skorzeny's commandos were on a mission to assassinate Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower and the aggressive General George Smith Patton, leading to a state of near total lockdown where even high-ranking officers were treated with suspicion. Military police established checkpoints every few miles, discarding standard passwords in favor of cultural questions like the name of Mickey Mouse's girlfriend or the capital of obscure states, creating a bottleneck that threatened to slow the very relief mission Bastogne so desperately needed. Patton, however, refused to be deterred by the threat of assassins, viewing the lockdown as an insult to his momentum while he prepared to execute the most audacious maneuver of the war. On December 19th, a grim meeting convened at the Allied headquarters in Versailles, where General Eisenhower looked at his maps and saw a growing disaster, with General Omar Bradley warning that the entire Allied position in Western Europe could collapse if Bastogne fell. The mood was one of desperation until George Smith Patton walked into the room, his piercing blue eyes seeing an opportunity to trap the German flank where others saw only catastrophe, and Eisenhower turned to him with the order to take charge and hit the German flank to relieve the garrison. Patton made a claim that stunned every hardened commander in the room, by promising to attack with 3 divisions in 72 hours, a feat that military logic dictated was impossible because his Third Army was currently 90 miles south and heavily engaged in active combat. The room fell into a stunned silence because Patton was proposing to disengage from active combat, pivot his entire army 90 degrees, and move over 100,000 men and 15,000 vehicles through a blizzard over icy roads in just 3 days. General Bradley pulled Eisenhower aside, insisting that even for Patton, this was a fantasy that would take 10 days at minimum. But Patton stood firm because he had already alerted his staff to start planning the movement 24 hours earlier in anticipation of the crisis. This was the essence of old blood and guts, a man who saw the path through obstacles before others even recognized the threat. And after Eisenhower gave him the green light with a warning that failure meant the death of the garrison, Patton saluted and quietly promised that they would not die because he would not fail. The moment Patton arrived at his headquarters in Luxembourg, he activated a machine gun precision operation, tapping the 4th Armored Division to lead the spearhead, while the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions supported the flanks in a massive column that stretched for miles through the frozen landscape. The challenge was staggering, as standard doctrine said the road network could not handle such a rapid influx, and radio communications were expected to fail. Yet Patton's logistical team, led by Colonel Paul Harkins, had already drafted movement schedules and fuel requirements with surgical detail. On December 22nd, the movement began as Third Army units disengaged from the enemy under the cover of darkness and their own artillery fire, executing a perfect pivot that turned the tide of the war. The conditions were nightmarish as December 1944 brought the coldest and snowiest winter in Belgian history, with temperatures dropping to 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit and turning the narrow roads into treacherous ribbons of black ice. Visibility frequently dropped to 0 in blinding snowstorms, and men wrapped themselves in whatever they could find to stave off frostbite while they marched and drove through the darkness, their eyes bloodshot from exhaustion. Behind the scenes, the logistics were a marvel of military engineering, as military police stood at every freezing crossroad, directing the flow of traffic to prevent gridlock, while maintenance crews followed the columns to recover broken-down vehicles, and supply trucks shuttled fuel forward constantly. The spy panic reached its peak during this march when General Patton's own Jeep was signaled to stop by a nervous young military police officer who was terrified he was looking at a German double in a high-quality disguise. The MP, refusing to be intimidated by the 3-star helmet or the ivory-handled revolvers, demanded that Patton name the capital of Illinois. And when Patton barked back, Springfield, the soldier hesitated, thinking the answer was Chicago. Patton began to fume, his face turning a deep shade of crimson as he was detained for several agonizing minutes under the freezing rain, a 3-star general held captive by a private because of the shadows cast by Skorzeny's commandos. While Patton dealt with the delays of the rear, the 4th Armored Division spearhead hit the 1st German defensive line outside the town of Martelange on December 23rd, where German engineers had destroyed the bridge over the Schur River and covered the crossing with mines. Commanding the lead element was Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who followed Patton's orders to drive fast and never stop by charging the crossing without waiting for careful reconnaissance, allowing engineers to throw up a temporary bridge under blistering fire. Sherman tanks rolled across with guns blazing, shattering the German position by nightfall. But Bastogne was still 40 miles away, and the clock was ticking down on the survival of the 101st Airborne. Inside Bastogne, the perimeter was shrinking as German infantry pushed closer, and surgeons were forced to operate without anesthesia in frozen cellars, while the paratroopers heard rumors of Patton's relief operation that seemed like a ghost story in the freezing hell of the foxholes. Every hour delayed was another hour. American paratroopers were dying in the snow. And at 3rd Army headquarters, Patton paced like a caged lion, demanding that his officers push harder because he understood that in war, time equals lives. He drove his men mercilessly because he knew that the blood spilled in the rush was the price of preventing a much larger slaughter within the besieged town, and he would sacrifice everything, including his own reputation, to keep his promise. By the dawn of December 23rd, the impossible began to materialize as the Third Army reached its jump-off points, and German intelligence officers watched from their observation posts in total disbelief as divisions that had been 90 miles south just days ago appeared on their flank. General Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, upon hearing that Patton was the commander responsible, nodded slowly because he knew only crazy Patton would dare such a maneuver and possess the willpower to execute it. The Germans feared him more than any other Allied general, remembering his lightning-fast race across Sicily and his dash through France. And now they prepared to throw every available reserve to block his path. On Christmas Eve, the weather reached a level of ferocity that threatened to halt the entire relief effort, with winds howling through the hulls of the Sherman tanks and lubricants in the machine guns beginning to freeze solid. Patton, a firm believer in the spiritual weight of leadership, turned to his chaplain and demanded a prayer for good weather, wanting a blanket of clear sky so his P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers could rain destruction on the German panzers. Whether by divine intervention or a sudden shift in the atmosphere, the clouds began to break as the sun glinted off the snow for the first time in days, and the roar of Allied aircraft filled the sky to pinpoint German ambushes for the advancing tanks. The atmosphere within General George Smith, Patton's mobile command post, was thick with more than just the smell of cigar smoke and wet wool. It was saturated with a growing sense of invisible dread as the Third Army's steel columns churned the Belgian snow into a gray slush. The report of the spy panic began to outpace the actual reports of enemy contact, and Operation Greif was no longer just a rumor. It had become a corrosive force eating at the morale of the American logistical tail, forcing Patton to divide his attention between the massive panzers blocking the road and the ghosts in American uniforms waiting in the shadows. The intelligence briefings grew increasingly frantic as December 24th progressed, with captured German saboteurs beginning to confess details of an elite hit squad already in Paris led by Otto Skorzeny, with the specific intent of capturing or killing General Eisenhower and General Patton. While Eisenhower was essentially locked in his headquarters for safety, Patton was outraged by the suggestion of caution, famously remarking that he was more concerned about being shot by one of his own nervous sentries than by a German commando. Yet the reality was that Skorzeny's men were successfully creating a strategic pause without firing a single shot, and Patton realized that if his officers spent 3 hours at every crossroads debating the identity of their peers, the 101st Airborne would be a memory. The tactical nuance of Patton's response was a masterclass in psychological management, as he ordered his commanders to ignore the spy hunt at the front lines and maintain reconnaissance by fire, meaning that if a vehicle failed to identify itself with immediate aggressive American slang, it was to be treated as hostile. This ruthlessness was the only way to maintain the 72-hour pace while the German 5th Panzer Army was desperately trying to utilize the confusion by positioning heavy Panther tanks in ambush holes beneath the snow. Patton's armor, however, wasn't stopping for traditional scouting, and under the direction of Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the Shermans kept their engines roaring and their turrets spinning, saturating every suspicious tree line with machine gun fire. By midday on Christmas Eve, the weather had become the ultimate arbiter of the conflict as the freezing rain turned into a blinding whiteout, momentarily grinding the Third Army to a halt and forcing Patton to distribute his famous weather prayer to every soldier in the field. He demanded that the heavens open up so his thunderbolts could clear the way, and the psychological impact of seeing their commander challenge the very elements gave the freezing GIs a renewed sense of purpose. When the clouds finally tore open and the P-47 pilots began diving onto German supply columns, the air rang with cheers from the mud-caked infantry because the eyes in the air finally allowed Patton to see the German traps before his tanks walked into the slaughter. Inside Bastogne, the situation had reached its terminal phase as the paratroopers of the 101st were reduced to scavenging German weapons for ammunition and using cardboard from K ration boxes to line their boots against the frostbite. General McAuliffe, despite his nuts defiance, knew that his perimeter was thin enough to break with a single concerted armored thrust, and the Germans launched a massive tank assault on the western perimeter near Hemrula in the pre-dawn darkness of Christmas Day. In the ensuing chaotic nightmare fought with bazookas and sticky grenades, the paratroopers held their ground, but they were down to their last handful of anti-tank rounds, serving as the anvil while the German hammer struck with desperation. Patton's logistical miracle was now being tested by the very roads he was trying to save, with over 20,000 tons of ammunition and fuel being moved daily along the Patton corridor by the unsung heroes of the Red Ball Express. These drivers navigated mountain passes where a single slip meant a 1,000-foot drop into the abyss. And Patton was frequently seen at the side of the road, not just observing, but actively directing traffic with his gloved hands. His presence was a constant reminder that the old blood and guts philosophy applied to everyone, ensuring that the momentum of the relief mission never faltered despite the nightmarish conditions and the constant threat of sabotage. On the morning of December 26, the final barrier to Bastogne lay at the village of Bastogne, which the Germans had fortified with anti-tank guns and elite Fallschirmjäger units to ensure the gate remained closed. Patton authorized a time-on-target artillery barrage of unprecedented scale, coordinating every available gun to fire so that their shells landed in Bastogne at the exact same second, shattering the German defenders' will to fight. In the eerie silence that followed the earth-shattering blast, Creighton Abrams gave the final order for Cobra King to lead the charge into the heart of the village, marking the beginning of the end for the German siege. The final dash was a 3-mile gauntlet of fire where the Sherman tanks of the 4th Armored Division kept their throttles wide open, firing their 75mm guns on the move without slowing to engage individual targets. They crashed through German roadblocks and overran infantry foxholes before the defenders could even reload their Panzerfausts. And at precisely 4:50 p.m., the lead tank, Cobra King, crested the final ridge overlooking the battered ruins of Bastogne. Lieutenant Charles Bogus looked through his periscope and saw the unmistakable silhouettes of American paratroopers rising from their holes, signaling that the siege was finally broken and Patton had kept his 72-hour promise to the minute. The meeting between the tank crews and the paratroopers was a moment of profound, silent respect, as the men of the 101st, though skeletal and shredded, did not look like defeated men when they asked their rescuers what had taken them so long. Patton had moved 3 divisions across a frozen wasteland, navigated a labyrinth of German saboteurs, and punched a hole in Hitler's final offensive that would never be closed, proving that his aggressive, tactical vision was the only way to achieve victory. The battered bastards of Bastogne were no longer alone, and the boxes of ammunition and medical supplies flowing into the town marked the definitive failure of the German gamble in the Ardennes. But the spy panic had one final dark chapter, as several German commandos from Operation Greif were captured near the bridgeheads and sentenced to death by firing squad after a swift military commission. These executions, carried out in the freezing Belgian morning, served as a grim reminder of the high stakes of the Ghost War and the ruthlessness required to secure the rear. Patton watched the reports with cold satisfaction, having defeated the enemy in front and the enemy within, and he knew that the German spirit had been broken by the sheer, brutal willpower of an army that refused to accept the word impossible. In the days following the relief, Patton did not allow his men to rest, using the Bastogne corridor as a funnel to pour more divisions into the German flank and squeeze the Bulge from the south while the First Army pushed from the north. The German retreat soon turned into a rout, and General Omar Bradley, who had once been the most vocal critic of Patton's reckless pace, finally admitted to Eisenhower that George Patton was the only man who could have executed such a miracle. The old blood and guts style was now recognized as the only weapon sharp enough to cut through the Ardennes winter and shatter the final offensive of the Third Reich. The human cost of the relief was staggering, with the 4th Armored Division alone suffering thousands of casualties to open the road, leaving the snow in the fields around Bastogne stained red for weeks. Patton saw these casualties as a tragic but necessary investment in a faster victory, believing that every mile gained in December saved 10 miles of fighting and thousands of lives in the spring. As he toured the liberated hospitals in Bastogne, he didn't offer platitudes but rather his presence, reminding the wounded that they were part of a victory that would define the 20th century and the future of the free world. The legacy of the relief of Bastogne is the story of the triumph of leadership over chaos, proving that the American military could outplan and outfight the best the Wehrmacht had to offer under the most extreme conditions. Patton's 72-hour miracle remains a foundational case study in military mobility, showing that in the face of absolute disaster and internal paranoia, a singular, aggressive will can reshape the course of history. As the sun set over the liberated crossroads, the German hope for a negotiated peace died in the frozen mud of Belgium, and the legend of George Smith Patton was forever etched into the annals of military greatness. George Smith Patton would go on to lead the Third Army across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany, But the relief of Bastogne would always be his finest hour as he faced the German army, the winter, and the ghosts of Operation Greif. The paratroopers he saved would never forget the roar of the Sherman tanks or the face of the general who refused to leave them behind, and the name Old Blood and Guts became a symbol of American resilience. The war moved one giant step closer to Allied victory, and the world learned that when the task is impossible, George Patton is the man you call to deliver the miracle. As the smoke began to clear over the frozen ridges of the Ardennes, the magnitude of the German defeat became visible in the endless columns of weary prisoners being marched toward the rear, their spirits broken by the relentless pressure of the Third Army. These soldiers, once the spearhead of Hitler's final gamble, now moved in a hollow silence, passing by the very American tank columns they had hoped to destroy just days earlier. For General Patton, this sight was the ultimate validation of his old blood and guts philosophy. It was proof that speed, aggression, and an unwavering will could shatter even the most elite divisions of the Wehrmacht. The relief of Bastogne was not merely a tactical success in breaking a siege, but a strategic masterstroke that drained the lifeblood out of the German offensive, turning their ambitious Watch on the Rhine into a desperate, chaotic retreat that would continue all the way to the heart of Berlin. Today, the star-shaped Martyrsum Memorial stands in silent majesty over the hills of Bastogne, serving as a permanent testament to the courage of the men who refused to surrender and the general who did the impossible to save them. The winds that once carried the freezing blizzards of 1944 now whisper through the stone pillars, carrying the names of the thousands who bled to hold this ground. The legacy of General George Smith Patton and the 72-hour miracle remains etched into the history of World War II, reminding future generations that in the darkest hour of the war, leadership was the light that pierced the fog. The siege was broken, the ghosts of Operation Greif were laid to rest, and the path to final victory was paved by the iron tracks of the Third Army, ensuring that the sacrifice of those who fought in the snow would never be forgotten by a world that owes them its freedom. General Patton was willing to risk his own life and the lives of thousands to maintain his 72-hour deadline. Do you think his aggressive time equals lives philosophy was the right choice? Or was it a dangerous ego trip? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.